Good afternoon to participants who are joining us from the East Coast, and good morning to our West Coast viewers. I am Monique Dixon, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy at the Office for Civil Rights of the U.S. Department of Education. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedules to attend today's virtual convening, Brown, 67 Years Later, Examining Disparities in School Discipline and the Pursuit of Safe and Inclusive Schools. Over 1,200 individuals registered for today's event, indicating how important the topic of today's convening is to all of you. We will begin our time together with opening remarks from Suzanne Goldberg, Acting Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education, followed by Pamela Carlin, Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. Suzanne?
Thank you so much, Monique, and good afternoon and good morning and good evening, wherever you are. I'm Suzanne Goldberg, Acting Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights in the United States Department of Education, and I am truly honored to welcome you to today's convening. This convening is being hosted jointly by the Department of Education Office for Civil Rights and the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. And as you just heard, you'll be welcomed soon by my colleague Pamela Carlin from the Justice Department. In the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, our mission is to ensure equal access to education and to promote educational excellence throughout the nation through vigorous enforcement of federal civil rights laws. I want to assure you that we pursue this mission day in and day out, working around the clock with a full commitment to equity and equal opportunity for students throughout the United States. As we open this convening, I want to pose a question. Why focus on disparities in school discipline to mark the anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education? As you know, Brown versus Board of Education was decided unanimously by the U.S. Supreme Court 67 years ago. And it is widely known for declaring an end to school segregation based on race, with its landmark holding that separating students by race in education is inherently unequal and unconstitutional. Importantly, in its opinion in Brown, the court also underscored these 2 points. First, that education is perhaps the most important function of state and local governments. And second, in these days, the court said, it is doubtful that any child can reasonably be expected to be successful in life if that child is denied the opportunity of an education. Yet we know from the CRDC, that is the civil rights data collection conducted by the Office for Civil Rights since 1968, that today, 67 years after Brown, opportunity remains unequal. And in particular, as is our focus for today, that exclusionary disciplinary practices, such as out-of-school suspensions and referrals to law enforcement, are imposed disproportionately on our students, on our nation's students of color, students with disabilities, and others. Stepping back for a moment, it's important to recognize that this is not a new issue. Disparities in school discipline have been documented for decades, including in a 1975 report from the Children's Defense Fund called School Suspensions, Are They Helping Children? This report found, based on OCR's civil rights data collection, that Black students were being disciplined at a higher rate than any other students, and not because of higher rates of misbehavior. Coming closer to the present, I'm glad to share there's a hint of good news, at least at the start of a hopeful trajectory, thanks to the hard work of many people here today and many educators and school officials and advocates and students around the country. The data show that exclusionary school disciplinary practices decreased by 2% between the 2015-16 school year and the 2017-18 school year. Still, there is a lot to do. As you will hear from our speakers today, students of color and especially Black students remain significantly overrepresented in the numbers of students who receive out-of-school suspensions as compared to white students. Suspension rates for students with disabilities are also highly concerning. And we see marked disparities at the intersection of identities. For example, with girls of color, especially Black girls, being suspended at higher rates than their peers. Reports from stakeholders also raised concern about LGBTQI+ students facing disproportionate discipline in schools. This convening is thus fully part of the Biden-Harris administration's focus on and commitment to equity and a government-wide effort to support and ensure equity and opportunities across the United States. Today's convening is also an important part of the Department of Education's work on the safe reopening of our nation's schools for all students. Our conversation today will inform any actions the Departments of Education and Justice take to issue guidance to schools and families on fair discipline and safe and supportive schools. And we will soon announce an additional effort to seek information from you, from the public at large, on these issues. I will turn this to my DOJ colleague in just a moment, but first I want to thank the outstanding speakers who have joined us for 3 important panels today. Our first panel, Perspectives on Disparities in School Discipline, will focus on the speakers' experiences of confronting and addressing discriminatory and harmful school discipline practices and the impact of those policies on students of color, LGBTQI+ students, and students with disabilities. Panel 2 will give us an important and interesting window onto what the research says about identifying and addressing these disparities. And panel 3 will turn also very importantly to lessons from the field in addressing disparities in discipline and promoting positive school climate. I also want to thank my colleagues in the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights and in the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division for all of their work in putting together today's convening. And I thank all of you for joining us today and for all you do to ensure equal opportunity for all of our nation's students. It is my honor now to turn the podium to Pamela Karlan, Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice.
Thanks so much, Suzanne, and thanks so much for having me here today. It's an honor to be with you. On a personal note, a dozen years after Brown, I began kindergarten in a public school that had only 3 Black students in it. By the time I had graduated, the system had adopted a voluntary busing plan across my city's neighborhood, and my school was then 35% Black. Before my last year in high school there, in the summer of 1975, I read Simple Justice, a marvelous history of the litigation that led up to Brown against Board of Education. And I decided I wanted to go to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and be a school desegregation lawyer. And though through some twists and turns, I ended up doing primarily voting rights and employment discrimination litigation instead, I never forgot the central role that schools play. They are, as the court wrote in Brown, and as Suzanne just said a moment ago, perhaps the most important function of state and local governments. We're here to reflect on the promise of Brown and on our unfinished work to deliver on that promise. Brown was both an end and a beginning. It was the culmination of a multi-year and nationwide campaign that went for decades of students, of parents, of advocates and lawyers to change the law on the books and to establish the unconstitutionality of school desegregation. But it was only the beginning of a quest to make real the promise of that ruling in school districts and communities across the country, a quest that continues today. As you probably know, Brown was actually 4 cases from 4 different places, one from Delaware, one from South Carolina, one from Topeka, Kansas, and one from Prince Edward County, Virginia. And that last case has a special resonance in thinking about our topic for today. Barbara Johns, whose statue now stands in the nation's capital, was 16 years old when she grew tired of seeing the roomy school bus that transported white students while she waited for her overcrowded bus to arrive. And every day, instead of going to that modern school, Barbara's bus transported her to a small, ill-equipped schoolhouse in a rural farming town in Prince Edward County. So one day, 70 years ago, she organized a school-led walkout by the students to protest their facilities. And later, she and another student wrote a letter to the NAACP asking for help. And Simple Justice describes how the students in that strike were threatened with discipline, discriminatory discipline, for standing up, as well as describing how the lawyers took the case to the Supreme Court. The Brown decision marked the beginning of a decades-long fight to realize the promise of true equality. That fight was met with massive resistance. Prince Edward County, where Barbara Johns led the walkout, closed its public schools, all of them, rather than desegregate. The schools remained closed for 6 years until another Supreme Court decision forced county leaders to reopen them. Even 25 years later, when I was teaching at UVA, many of the county's white students continued to attend private schools that had opened as segregation academies during the era of massive resistance in Prince Edward County. There were lawsuits throughout the country seeking to realize the promise of Brown, filed by the Department of Justice, but also by public interest organizations like the ACLU or the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and others. Some of those lawsuits are still going on a half century later. The Civil Rights Division is still involved in 140 of them, a sobering number. At first, the lawsuits were simply about getting Black students into the same buildings as their white counterparts. But in the decades since Brown, DOJ has fought alongside students and their families to achieve equality inside those buildings. In doing that work, we've confronted the lingering effects of state-sponsored segregation, and we found new and sometimes subtle forms of discrimination, including in-school discipline, the focus of today's convening. The persistence of these disparities jeopardizes Brown's legacy. That legacy is at risk when students of color face unfair and disproportionate risk of arrest, when students with disabilities face unnecessary segregation, when students who are punished for not following dress and grooming codes that are rooted in race or gender stereotypes, and when students are forced to learn in hostile environments or harassed, sometimes even by school officials for being who they are. Discriminatory discipline, like overt segregation, can, in Brown's words, affect students' hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone. It is a step in alienating them from school and from its opportunities, and in placing them into a pipeline that leads to prison. To deliver on the promise of Brown, we have to look inside the schoolhouses and at the intersections of race, disability, national origin, and sex. As the court told us in Brown, the opportunity for an education is a right which must be made available to all on equal terms. That does not mean on equal terms only for white students, or only for students without disabilities, or only for cisgender and straight students. We have to make education available on equal terms for all students. Let me give two examples of the kind of work the Civil Rights Division is doing to realize Brown's promise that bear on today's conference. In Toledo, Ohio, the Civil Rights Division recently settled an investigation into school discipline. In Toledo, as in so many school districts, we found that Black students were more likely to be excluded from class for some offenses, but were less likely than white students to receive supportive responses, like meeting with school counselors. This was true even when the Black students who were more severely punished were the same age, had the same disciplinary histories, and had broken the same disciplinary rules as their white classmates. And to give you a sense that these problems can be fixed, let me just say a few words about a system 200 miles south down I-75. The division just finished monitoring a settlement agreement in Covington, Kentucky, where we found that the school district had discriminated in how it disciplined Black students and students with disabilities. That agreement was designed to help school staff identify and meet the needs of their students, including students with disabilities and students of color, and to use de-escalation techniques instead of other forms of discipline. In the first year, the district's high school, which had always had the highest number of disciplinary referrals, lowered those referrals by 90%. An administrator told division lawyers that this reduction occurred when the division realized that the responsibility for creating an affirmative school atmosphere was on the adults, not on the students. During the 4 years that the settlement was in place, the district went from relying on exclusionary discipline, restraints, seclusion, and law enforcement to giving its students the positive supports and the behavioral interventions they needed to succeed. These are just two systems, though, and there's still so much work to be done. One of the reasons I'm excited about this convening is because it's brought together advocates, researchers, school district staff, and students who, like Barbara Johns, are using their voices to address the ongoing discipline disparities in our nation's schools. These partnerships are critical. These students, and all of you, continue to hold our institutional feet to the fire, as you should. You are the experts, and we are here to listen. In the Civil Rights Division, we recognize the progress we've made. We acknowledge that the struggle continues. To all of the students who are joining us today, We are paying attention to you. Thank you for making your voices heard.
Thank you, Suzanne and Pam, for those remarks. Viewers, please stay where you are. We will begin panel 1 shortly. Hello again, and welcome to our first panel of the afternoon, Perspectives on Disparities in School Discipline. We have assembled an impressive panel of advocates, attorneys, and students who will share their experiences confronting and addressing disparities in the administration of school discipline policies and the impact of these policies on students of color, LGBTQI+ students, and students with disabilities. Earlier today, we emailed viewers who registered for this event the bios of all panelists. I invite you to read them at your leisure. We will use a question and answer format for this panel. I will ask each panelist a question. The panelists will have 3 to 4 minutes to respond. During the second round of questions, I will ask panelists to respond to one question in particular and to do so in 1 minute. If time permits and technology cooperates, I will ask questions from the audience. Viewers, if you have a question, please email it to schoolclimate@ed.gov. That's schoolclimate@ed.gov. All right, let's get started. We'll begin with introductions from panelists, and I will ask them to introduce themselves, their name, title, organization, and the location of their organization as well, so we'll know where they are in the nation. Let's begin with Michelle Turnage-Young.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. I am Michelle Turnage-Young. I'm Senior Counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Our organization has offices in New York, Washington, D.C., and Atlanta. And Monique, let me know if I've forgotten something that I was supposed to say.
Nope, that's perfect. Thank you. Ames Simmons.
Hello, y'all. My name is Ames Simmons, and my pronouns are he and him. I am a queer, white, transgender male attorney who's policy director at National Center for Transgender Equality, which is located in Washington, D.C., but I am coming to you from North Carolina.
Great, thanks. Quindin.
Hi, everyone. I'm Quindin, Executive Director of CRAC, the Southeast Asia Resource Action Center. We're based in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for having us.
Catherine Dunn.
Hi, y'all. It's great to be here. I'm Catherine Dunn. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Program Director of the Opportunity to Learn program at Advancement Project National Office, which is based in Washington, D.C.
Great. Caesar.
Hello, everyone. My name is Caesar. I'm with Power Youth Center for Social Change, and we're based in Miami, Florida. Thank you for having us.
Great. Maya.
Hi, everyone. My name is Maya. I'm also with Power Youth Center for Social Change, and we are located in Miami, Florida.
Excellent. Thank you so much, panelists. Well, let's get started with the Q&A. The first question is for Michelle Turnage-Young. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund has engaged in policy reform work and litigation to address racial disparities in school discipline and its impact on Black students and other students of color. What can you tell us about the experiences of students that you represent, the type of disciplinary actions your clients are confronting, and what, if any, disparities are you seeing based on gender?
So, like driving while Black, going to school while Black means being at high risk of being removed from class as a result of the selective application of subjective rules. We're seeing the criminalization of Black childhood, where race-neutral policies and practices are being applied in ways that profile, single out, and disproportionately burden Black students for engaging in normal, developmentally appropriate childhood behavior, or for simply wearing their hair as it grows out of their head, or wearing protective styles intimately connected to Black identity. So, for example, in some school districts where we work, more than 50% of the Black middle and high school students are being issued office disciplinary referrals, while 30 or 40% are being given suspensions. At some schools, more than 70% of the Black student population has been removed from class due to discipline, and Black students are 4, 5, 6, and 7 times as likely as their white classmates to be deprived of valuable instructional time as a result of the application of discipline. We often find that the most commonly cited reasons these students are being removed from class are minor, nonviolent, subjective infractions, like dress and grooming code violations, disruption, disrespect, defiance, and insubordination. And when we actually depose educators to ask them what behavior these rules prohibit, their understanding varies from one educator to the next. In some of our school districts, if out-of-school suspensions were reserved for objectively violent behavior, the incidence of Black middle and high school students being given out-of-school suspensions would decrease by 30% or more. The incidence of Black elementary school students being given out-of-school suspensions would decrease about 20% or more. We've also seen law enforcement supplanting the role of teachers in addressing developmentally appropriate childhood misbehavior, meaning that racially discriminatory administration of discipline now has criminal implications. I will give you 2 examples from our casework. In Binghamton, New York, 4 Black and Latinx 12-year-old girls were strip searched and placed in alternative school after the school principal saw them giggling. These searches were done without parental notification. During the searches, school officials made inappropriate comments about the girls' bodies. To date, school officials have not identified any reason for the strip searching or the removal from school. Other than that, the girls seemed hyper and giddy. The girls are having a hard time trusting adults. They don't feel comfortable at school. They have been affected in very unfortunate ways. And it's really troubling to see that school officials saw joyous Black and Latina 12-year-old girls, and they immediately suspected them of illicit drug use, rather than seeing the girls for what they were, happy children. In Mont Bellevue, Texas, 2 Black male students began growing locks in middle school in homage to their Black and West Indian heritage. School officials suggested that their hair fell short of the school district's standard of excellence. School administrators began to frequently pull the boys out of class to inspect their hair, depriving them of valuable instructional time. Eventually, the school informed our clients that they would no longer be allowed to attend class or participate in extracurricular activities or school events like graduation unless they cut their locks. After the school followed through on its threat and denied our clients more than a week of instruction, our clients were forced to move to a neighboring school district to continue their education. The school denied one of our clients the opportunity to attend his high school graduation with classmates he had been in school with since kindergarten. Though the school's policy is race neutral, the school's disciplinary records show that they were enforcing that policy more frequently and more harshly against Black boys. Months later, the school still intended to confine our younger client to in-school suspension and exclude him from school activities until he cut his locks. And so last August, we obtained a preliminary injunction barring the school district from enforcing that policy, allowing our client to finally return to class. These are just a couple of examples of what we're seeing and what absolutely should not be happening in our schools.
Great. Thank you, Michelle, and thank you and the Legal Defense Fund so much for your work. We have one more panelist who I would like to have her introduce herself before we continue. Diane Smith-Howard.
Hi, yes, I'm Diane Smith-Howard. I'm a managing attorney for criminal and juvenile justice at the National Disability Rights Network. Thank you for the opportunity to present today on today's panel. NDRN is a nonprofit managed membership organization for the nationwide network of protection advocacy agencies. There are PNAs in every state and territory, including a PNA affiliated with the Native American Consortium in the 4 corners of the Southwest region. We're a network of legal services agencies that provide free legal services to people with disabilities across their lifespan.
Great. And while we have you up, Diane, tell us a little bit about what you're seeing among your clients, students, the discipline of students with disability in general, and students with disabilities who are confined in residential facilities such as youth detention centers in particular?
Sure. So PNAs represent thousands of children with disabilities per year, and much of our education work involves students with disabilities who are also children of color. Discipline disparities are most pronounced across the country for children who are members of more than one protected class. So that's a significant issue that we are seeing across the board, and it impacts the larger work that we do. So the negative outcomes for the failure to provide sufficient and appropriate behavior support services in school include suspension, expulsion, restraint and seclusion, particularly of children with disabilities or disability-related behavior, corporal punishment, abuse by staff and school resource officers, referral to police, the juvenile justice system, and/or involuntary commitment to psych hospitals, and segregation into poor quality alternative schools and special ed classrooms. And a form of removal that goes under discussed and is underrepresented in the media, but well represented in schools, is the use of informal removal, which is the removal by the school district for disability-related behaviors without due process or legal required protections, resulting in discrimination and segregation. It's an end run around the discipline protections of the law and is currently off the books and is used primarily for children from disenfranchised families. So it's presented to families as a benign alternative to suspension, but there is nothing benign about it. This includes repeated sent homes, often after the child qualifies for the state per pupil funding for the day, placement on homebound with 1 to 5 hours of tutoring per week, or now these children are being kept out on virtual and not allowed to return to school when their classmates are returning, shortened school day for months at a time, and there are a number of other local variations on the same problem. So this is a problem of significant proportions, and as a result, we need data collection on it at the state and local level. It needs to be included in the civil rights data collection. There needs to be clear guidance by the Department of Ed that these practices are illegal and permissible, and there needs to be enforcement by government at the state and federal level around this practice, which is truly ubiquitous and harms a great number of children with disabilities who are also children of color. In addition, there needs to be diversion of misincarcerated youth. Children with disabilities are often referred to juvenile justice due to the failure of other systems to meet their needs. And then quickly and lastly, juvenile justice facilities, children with disabilities are disproportionately represented there. They're placed in detention at higher rates and they stay there longer. And the educational services they receive there are very poor quality. They lack transferable credit, and there's no transition planning. In addition, children with disabilities are unequally placed in residential treatment facilities, away from families, school and community supports, and at great public expense. Education, these facilities suffer from the same barriers as in juvenile justice facilities. So we ask that the department view these issues as a whole, that they're the result of a need for well-supported community and school-based behavioral services for the children who need them, and enforcement of the existing laws. Segregation, school removal, abuse, juvenile justice referrals, and residential placement are just symptoms of this larger failure.
Thank you so much, Diane, and for the work that you do every day. Viewers, if you would like to ask questions of our panelists, please remember to submit your questions to schoolclimate@ed.gov. Schoolclimate@ed.gov. Let's bring Ames Simmons into the conversation. So Michelle talked a little bit about the impact of school discipline policies on girls. And the National Center for Transgender Equality supports transgender and gender nonconforming students. What can you share about their experiences as it relates to school discipline and school climate issues?
Thank you, Monique. What we know is trans students are having a hard time at school, and it's getting steadily worse and increasingly dire for them. When we think about why transgender students are facing disproportionate rates of discipline, we have to also understand the lack of safety that they're experiencing and trying to protect themselves from. We know from the 2019 Youth Risk Behavior Survey that bullying and violence are worsening for transgender students. So transgender youth are more than twice as likely to have been bullied on school property at 43% compared to 18% of cisgender or non-trans youth. And even more starkly, transgender students were more than 4 times more likely to have been threatened or injured with a weapon on school property than cisgender students at 29% compared to 7%. If you had to go to school knowing that there is a 1 in 3 chance that you might be hurt by a weapon, you would have to start thinking about how you're going to defend yourself. And surprisingly, or perhaps unsurprisingly, transgender students reported higher rates of in-school discipline like detention and out-of-school discipline like suspension or expulsion. And 2019 data from GLSEN show that transgender female students were more likely than any other students to experience both in-school and out-of-school discipline, 8.6 for out-of-school and 40% for in-school. So why trans feminine students? GLSEN says to think about transgender students generally may be more targeted for discipline because they're more visible and or more stigmatized. Plus, it's generally more socially acceptable to appear masculine in our society than to appear feminine. So transgender girls are bearing the brunt early on of anti-Black misogyny. And I bring up anti-Blackness because we now have a study about the unique experiences of transgender women of color when they were in the school system from a 2020 study. So anti-transgender school expulsion was associated with greater odds of anti-trans mistreatment by police and with greater odds of incarceration. And the study also found that anti-trans victimization at school was associated with greater odds of incarceration. So we're back to where we started with the interrelation of an unsafe school climate with greater odds of entering the school to prison pipeline. And in fact, the study concluded that policy interventions to address anti-trans school victimization and institutional discrimination are a critical component of disrupting the school to prison pipeline for Black transgender women, the most vulnerable students in our classrooms. So when we think about what kinds of guidance school systems might need, we should be asking, in this current environment of school hardening with surveillance, with school police, how can we make sure that already marginalized students are not further marginalized in the process of making schools safer? How can we avoid net widening? How does adding metal detectors adequately shift the life experience of a transgender student who believes that they have to keep a gun in order to protect themselves from bullies? And what type of community-based solutions will move this conversation forward around increased safety for all students?
Great. Thank you so much, Ames, and for the work of your organization as well. Let's move on to Quindin. The Southeast Asian Resource Action Center's education policy work focuses on providing equitable educational opportunities for Southeast Asian students. Please share the school discipline reform and climate work you've done on behalf of these students, Quinn.
Great, thank you so much, Monique. To start out, I just want to share that on this 67th anniversary of Brown v. Board of Education, I deeply honor the long legacy of the civil rights movement that led to this monumental decision. And that's because had it not been for the civil rights movement and the widening of social policies that were possible under court cases and policies such as Brown, TREX communities would not be here today. Communities comprised of refugees from Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, resulting from the biggest refugee crisis that the world had ever seen, coming out of the wars across Southeast Asia, including the Vietnam War and the Secret War in Laos, making our communities the largest community of refugees ever to be resettled in America, including those like my parents who risked their lives as boat people from Vietnam, not knowing whether they would live or die, so that today I could be free. Because when over 60% of the American public disapproved of increasing refugee resettlement in the 70s, it was leaders from the civil rights movement who in 1978 placed an ad in the New York Times titled, "Black Americans Urge Admissions of the Indo-Chinese Refugees because our struggle for freedom is tied to theirs." Today, our communities number over 2.5 million, and our struggle for freedom continue to be tied. Today, especially under the COVID pandemic, increased attention has been paid to our communities as victims of increased hate and violence. But the underlying causes of racism and racial stereotypes have affected our youth far before the pandemic. And it seems starkly in school discipline and school climate experiences where our young people are overly disciplined, overly bullied, and yet also systemically invisible and ignored. Unknown to many, our students are overly disciplined similar to other students of color. In a research study by Khmer Girls in Action in Long Beach, California, of 500 Cambodian youth, 40% of students believed that they were wrongly disciplined, with students identifying as male being more likely to report mistreatment because of their race. And in addition to this, our young people are also more likely to be victims of bullying. In a survey of over 800 AAPI youth in California, 1 in 2 reported being bullied in school because of their race or ethnicity, with young women reporting higher rates of bullying than young men, but non-binary AAPI youth reporting the highest rates of bullying. And finally, our students report a sense of being invisible and unrecognized, where their communities are invisible in the curriculum they're learning, where implicit bias and or stereotypes by educators leave students' needs unmet. For example, in a study in Lowell, Massachusetts, one researcher found that in classroom observations, teachers looked at their Southeast Asian students less times than any other students, rendering silence as understanding as opposed to a cry for help. And this invisibility is systemic, where data systems fail to disaggregate the Asian and Pacific Islander category, masking the experiences of our students as one monolithic group and perpetuating the mono-minority myth that all Asian Americans are doing well and don't need help, when in fact, nearly 30% of Southeast Asians have not completed a high school degree or passed a GED, a rate more than double the national average. So in other words, school discipline and school climate experiences are contributors to school push out for Southeast Asian students and tell us that Southeast Asian students don't feel like they belong, aren't understood, and oftentimes not even seen. So that's why on today's anniversary, this anniversary reminds us of our tied struggle for freedom and liberation as we and our partners nationwide fight for schools to be places where we belong. Through fighting for our right to be seen, through disaggregated data, through ethnic studies that foster not just visibility, but cross-cultural understanding, and our right to heal through restorative and transformative justice models, through culturally responsive student support services, through calling for an end to police in school and calling for school-based healthcare centers that allow all students to be whole and well. On today's anniversary, we're reminded that schools are often a microcosm of what we see in society. And that's why today we remind ourselves of our shared mission to create communities where we all belong in America, where young people belong to us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Quinn. We appreciate so much the work that you do. Again, viewers, if you would like to submit questions for our panelists, please send them to schoolclimate@ed.gov. We are receiving a few questions, so keep them coming. Catherine Dunn, let's move over to you. The Advancement Project's Opportunities to Learn program works to end the school to prison pipeline. Please tell us about this effort and how it addresses disparities in school discipline and promotes positive school climate.
Thanks so much for the question, Monique, and again for having me today. We believe at Advancement Project that ending the school to prison pipeline requires an end to all forms of policing of children, and we work to achieve that through the National Police Free Schools campaign. I should say I'm the newest member of our Opportunity to Learn team, so the work I'm talking about today is really the work that my colleagues who have been leading in this space have done, and as our team says, have been following young people to police-free schools. In 2018, we released a report in collaboration with our partners, We Came to Learn, which is a call to action for police-free schools at wecametolearn.com. In our report, we document the historical roots of policing in America's schools, including in the years following the important anniversary that we're examining today, as Black and Brown students integrated public schools and organized and advocated for themselves. The first school resource officers were assigned to schools in Flint, Michigan, a year before the Brown versus Board of Education decision, and over the years following the decision, expanded to other cities in response to Black and Latinx student movements and the control and criminalization of Black youth. In our report, we wanted to name that the origins of school police are not in response to school shootings, although over the past several decades, federal and state funding has drastically expanded for school policing under the guise of school safety. Today, Black students are 3 times more likely to attend a school with more security staff than mental health personnel, and over 1.5 million students attend schools with school police but no school counselors. Just as the origins of school police are not in safety for students, there's also no evidence that suggests school police do actually make students more safe. In fact, the opposite is true. Our We Came to Learn report documents the harms of school policing, including the disparate impact that policing has on students of color, students with disabilities, and students who are LGBTQ, centering the voices of young people from around the country who describe the everyday indignities that they experience at the hands of school police. Not only are Black and Brown students disproportionately referred to law enforcement and arrested, Black students make up 15% of all students, but over 30% of those arrested. But our We Came to Learn website catalogs for the first time note assaults of young people by school police officers. Since we began tracking these assaults over the past decade, we have documented over 150 instances of school police harming students, including through physical and sexual assault of mostly Black and Brown students. And these are just the instances that make the news, often because of a video recording of the assault. These assaults continue now, especially as students return to school in person. Just some examples of the incidents that we've cataloged that have led to students being assaulted by school police include being late to class and attempting unauthorized use of the school's elevator in Detroit, attempting to use the bathroom without a hall pass in Philadelphia, being tardy for school in Baltimore, breaking up a fight between 2 students in North Carolina, and refusing to put their cell phone away and refusing to leave class at the request of the teacher in South Carolina. We are joined with our partners, the Alliance for Educational Justice, and dozens of youth organizations working towards police-free schools. That is the dismantling of school policing infrastructure, culture, and practice, ending school militarization and surveillance, and building a new liberatory education system. Our team works to provide legal, policy, organizing, narrative change, and communications support on these campaigns. Some of the groups in the campaign are just emerging in their fights, and others have had significant wins and are now in the hard work of implementation. We saw historic progress during last summer's uprisings following the murder of George Floyd, and this progress resulted from years of struggle that young people have led, including wins in Oakland, Denver, Minneapolis, Seattle, Portland, Madison, and others. Just this past week, the young folks at Tenants and Workers United and their partners won a victory when the Alexandria City Council voted to divest $800,000 from school police and reinvest those funds in mental health supports. We know that far too many Black and Brown young people continue to be forced to interact with a system of policing that views them as a threat and not as students. But these victories and the incredible work of our partners, including like our friends at PowerU, I think we all agree we've saved the best for last on this panel, show us that a different future where young people are truly safe and able to come to school and learn and thrive is possible.
Thank you, Catherine. And yes, we did save the best for last. You know, we've been talking about the impact of school discipline on students, and now we're going to have a few students tell us from their vantage point what school discipline policies and school climate concerns they have. So let's start with Caesar from PowerU. Like the Advancement Project, PowerU Center for Social Change has worked to end the school-to-prison pipeline. And you particularly use youth organizing strategies, among other things. Talk to us about the school discipline work that you've done and are doing, and share the progress you've made over the years. Caesar, you're muted, dear.
Oh, I'm sorry. So, as y'all know, my name is Caesar. So, I'm part of PowerU Center for Social Change, and I'm also part of a committee within PowerU named the Counselors Not Cops Committee. So, the Counselors Not Cops Committee, it consists of youth organizers that's working towards putting a stop to the school to prison pipeline. And our committee work tackles issues such as the overspending of SROs in Miami-Dade County Public Schools and privatization of Miami-Dade education. So we're seeking to increase the funds for mental health in our schools by divesting from the school police budget and implementing those funds into mental health and other alternatives such as restorative justice practitioners, suicide bullying prevention programs, and improving school infrastructure. So the implementation of mental health, it will allow students to have an outlet for their problems, which will create a more comfortable and a more supportive space within the school community. And currently, the Miami-Dade County Public School Board believes that increasing SROs is the answer to all our problems, when in fact, they're the root of the problem. Okay, so currently, the Miami-Dade County Public School Board believes that increasing SROs is the answer to all our problems, when in fact, they're the root of the problem. Police officers do not create safety in our schools. For example, there was a time where an 11-year-old student was slammed by an SRO for refusing to give up their cell phone. Police officers abuse their power, they don't build relationships with students, but cause harm to them, which builds tension between students and SROs. And in the midst of the pandemic, SROs only have been used to knock on the doors of students who haven't been attending school. So we invest a large sum of funds towards the school police department when they aren't really needed in schools in this moment. So Florida is a SRO managed state, and in the MDCP, in Miami-Dade County Public Schools, we have a total of 392 schools in our county, but the mandate states that there's presumed to be at least one SRO for each school in the Miami-Dade County Public Schools. And the school board exceeded the mandate and added a total of 454 SROs in the schools of Miami. So that's basically some of the work that we're doing within our committee. And thank you.
So the question that we got from the audience is, when thinking about exclusionary practices, what action plan can teachers, paraprofessionals, and other school staff generate to address exclusionary practices and disparities? What can teachers do? What can paraprofessionals do to address what you all have been working on? Anyone can jump in.
I will jump in very quickly. Thanks for the question, Monique, or thanks for passing along the question, rather. I think that educators can, first of all, promote or advocate for a policy that they will not impose exclusionary discipline on students for minor nonviolent subjective infractions. I also think that educators can have a conversation with each other to ascertain whether they're actually interpreting these rules the same way. So if the school prohibits defiance, educators can speak to each other to see whether each of them have the same behavior in mind, or whether their understanding of the term defiance wildly varies from one another. That I'll just leave it there so that other people can contribute.
Thank you, Michelle. Well, let's see if we can get Maya to the video and hear from her. She's another student, member of PowerU.
Thank you. So we as PowerU are happy to be a part of the Alliance for Educational Justice, or AEJ, which is a national association that consists of approximately 30 intergenerational and youth organizing groups, all with the common goal to create safer school environments, making access to proper education equal for all students, regardless of their race or socioeconomic status. One of the problems that face our education systems today is the school-to-prison pipeline. For those who are unaware, the school-to-prison pipeline is a system where students of disadvantaged backgrounds are removed from schools due to suspension, expulsion, or arresting. And what influences such punishment are policies such as zero-tolerance policies or harsh disciplinary actions. These aspects push students out of schools into criminal justice systems, and these actions are directly targeted at students of color as well as students with disabilities. Statistically proven, Black students make up approximately 20% of Miami-Dade County Public Schools, yet make up nearly 50% of the students experiencing the criminal justice system. Therefore, Black students make up more of a population in prisons than they even do in schools. This goes to show how students of color are put into positions of failure just simply by attending schools. And by having increased SROs, which are school resource officers, actually makes it easier for the school-to-prison pipeline to be more obtainable because officers are now physically present in our schools to make arrests. Though SROs were established to promote safety, they actually do the opposite. The way that the school-to-prison pipeline system targets minorities and disabled students, SROs do the exact same. In Florida, a 16-year-old girl was body slammed by an officer, and a similar situation is seen with a 7-year-old student with autism who was handcuffed by 2 SROs in San Antonio, Texas. There are 3 commonalities within these 2 incidents. The first of which is that the SROs in reference were white men. The second is that both the students were students of color. And the third is that both incidents were caught on film. SROs continue to prove to us that they are biased through their consistency of targeting students who are disadvantaged in society. And many of the officers present in our schools don't even want to be there. One time, I actually took it upon myself to speak to an SRO at my school, and I asked him, was he given the position or if he wanted to do it? And he replied by saying, no, I didn't ask to be here and I don't want to be here. So if we have SROs who find no interest in being in our schools to protect students, why are they present? Police brutality against underprivileged students is not something seen just in particular regions on a smaller scale, but it is seen in every school district nationwide. In order to truly see improvement in our schools, it is a must that SROs are defunded and that alternatives such as mental health counselors are instead funded, being that mental health care is an essential part of human life because our brains are vital organs that need protection and support.
Thank you so much, Maya. And you ended with a recommendation, and I want to pick up from there. And this is the question that I want to have a rapid response by as many presenters as we can in the 3 minutes that we have left. And some of you have already done this in your opening remarks, made recommendations to the Office for Civil Rights at the Ed Department and the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice. So my question is, how can federal agencies like our 2 agencies best help state and local educational entities create positive school climates? And how can we help them identify, address, and remedy discriminatory student discipline policies and practices? So let's see how we will do this. If you would like to respond, raise your hand. Everyone knows how to use the hand symbol. Great. Let's see. Let's start with Diane Smith-Howard.
Sure, I just have a few. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Increasing federal oversight of juvenile justice conditions and misincarceration and residential treatment facilities, school removals of all kinds, segregation and abuse of students at school. I'm sure that'll be consistent with a number of others. Enforce the federal data requirements, such as the CRDC submissions, to make sure we're getting accurate data so we can change policies in consort with that, and increase the CRDC to an annual collection. Require data collection on informal removal through the use of attendance data, and provide unequivocal guidance to the field about what it is, why it's illegal, and how federal laws will be enforced by families and by government. Use federal funding incentives to increase positive school climate practices, decrease the use of residential treatment, eliminate school resource officers in schools, increase community-based mental health and placement alternatives, and provide dedicated funding to the PNAs who are enforcement partners with the departments. And lastly, provide guidance on restraint and seclusion and support for the Keeping All Students Safe Act and the Counseling Not Criminalization Act.
Quinn, do you want to go next?
Sure, I'll just add on to what Diane shared, which is one, to disaggregate any data collection by AAPI students. The API community is comprised of over 50 ethnic communities, and being seen as only one community is really harming our students and their ability to be seen. And just +1 to all the mental health support that we've heard loud and clear from our young people as well.
Great, thank you. We are unfortunately at time, so I want to take this opportunity to thank all of the panelists for taking time out of your day to share your experience and your expertise. We value everything that you said today. And at this point, if our viewers want to stand up and stretch, get a glass of water, please do so, but do not stay away long. We will begin panel 2 shortly. Thank you again, everyone.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for our second panel today. My name is Carolyn Seigling, and I am an attorney with the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. We have just heard about harmful school disciplinary policies and the impact these policies have on students. Now we are going to learn what the research says about identifying and addressing discipline disparities and how research can be used as a practical tool to push for equity. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our researchers for the second panel. As Monique said at the beginning, you should have received an email with their bios because their accomplishments are far too many to describe now. Our first panelist, Dr. Monique Morris, will speak about discipline and addressing the criminalization of Black girls. Our second panelist, Russell Skiba, will speak about disability disparities in school discipline and the virus of racism. And our third panelist, Olatunde Johnson, will speak about the importance of Title VI and other civil rights laws and how they can be used proactively by school districts. So Dr. Morris, let's begin. Please share some highlights of your research on discipline and addressing the criminalization of Black girls.
Thank you. Greetings, I am Monique Morris and I use she, her pronouns. Thank you for the invitation to join the conversation this afternoon. I'm dialing in from Brooklyn, New York, ancestrally known as Lenape land. I'm president and CEO of Grantmakers for Girls of Color, a philanthropic organization that invests in the just and liberated futures of girls, femmes who identify as Black, Indigenous, Latina, Asian, Arab, Pacific American, and other people of color. We currently resource more than 140 organizations in 29 states, Washington, D.C., Guam, and Puerto Rico. Many of these organizations are leading research and working toward educational justice and counter-criminalization efforts with and on behalf of Black girls and other girls of color. I've also been personally engaged as a topic of deep inquiry, the specific ways in which girls of color, particularly Black girls, are impacted by school discipline, the unique vulnerabilities they face as a function of historical conditions and frameworks that have shaped their experiences with educational institutions, and the potential remedies for interrupting what I call school to confinement pathways. I define school to confinement pathways as the policies, practices, conditions, and the prevailing consciousness. So what we think about specific children in this conversation, Black girls, that facilitate a risk of future contact with the juvenile court and criminal legal systems. While an increasing number of schools are developing alternative practices designed to divert students from exclusionary discipline, we know that racial disparities persist among those who remain along the pathways to criminalization and confinement. The most recent analysis of national data on school discipline conducted by the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality found that Black girls with and without diagnosed disabilities are approximately 4 times more likely than white girls to face suspension and expulsion, and are 5.3 times more likely to be transferred to an alternative school for disciplinary reasons. It's worth noting that across the spectrum of discipline, Black girls continue to experience a greater racial disparity than their male counterparts. For example, Black boys are nearly 2.6 times more likely than white boys to experience suspension, so there's still overrepresentation. But Black girls are 4 times more likely than white girls to experience suspension. Black boys are just under 2.5 times more likely than white boys to be arrested on campus, while Black girls are 3.6 times more likely than white girls to experience the same. My research with and on Black girls has revealed that the school-based pathways to delinquency are dynamic, and the disproportionate criminalization of Black girls is a function of racialized gender bias that produces learning environments that exacerbate harm. Black girls are overrepresented among youth in contact with the juvenile court system, and they disproportionately experience school discipline across the spectrum of discipline at every educational level, pre, during, and post-pandemic, in association with the adultification they experience, which is an age compression that renders Black girls vulnerable to the reading of their behaviors as more adult-like, which can lead them to being perceived as in need of less protection, less nurturing, and less worthy of opportunity for non-punitive interventions. Stereotypes and tropes about Black femininity as hypersexual or combative that lead adults to perceive their forms of expression as willfully defiant, and laws such as disturbing schools laws that criminalize normal adolescent behavior, such as talking loudly or questioning authority. All of this has facilitated the over-policing of Black girl bodies on and off campus by law enforcement and other instruments and agents of surveillance, and enforcement of dress code policies and other codes of conduct in a manner that reflect and reinforce racialized gender bias and, in some instances, rape culture. It's also worth noting that students, including Black girls, are disruptive when they experience disruption, such as any of the measures captured by the Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey, which maybe we can explore if there is time later. So it's important for those of us engaged in the design of educational policy and practice to develop interagency collaborations and strategies that prioritize effective responses to disruption, rather than pretend that by arresting students, using physical force with students, or removing them from the building, that by doing those actions, we are addressing the issue. Toward the goal of finding remedy to these disparities and conditions, schools have sought to implement a range of interventions, including professional development for educators, PBIS, restorative approaches, mindfulness, meditation, counseling, and the arts. But when implemented without a racial and gender analysis, these efforts fall short of addressing the demands of Brown versus Board of Education and the disparate impact of school discipline on Black students. School districts continue to collect information useful for monitoring progress and accountability, but I want to flag how critical it is that disaggregated data be collected, analyzed, and reported across the spectrum of formal and informal disciplinary decisions that inform risk of contact with the juvenile court system. Also, schools need guidance, incentives, financial resources, and other supports to increase their capacity to operate with culturally responsive strategies that engage the learning environment as facilitative of healing and liberation for all students, where students across racial and gender continua and their families co-construct policies, practices, and learning conditions with educators toward the goal of generating schools that perform as safe havens for learning and youth development. This requires the development of guidance, toolkits, and other resources to structure learning environments that exhaust alternatives to exclusionary discipline before seeking to engage these reprimands. We also address disparities in discipline by not criminalizing normal adolescent behavior through codes of conduct that are facially race and gender neutral, but which result in differential outcomes because they're enforced in a biased manner. By moving toward police-free schools and by not relying on law enforcement to patrol schools or respond to acts that reflect student dysregulation in ways that are not violations of law, and by responding to student dysregulation through age-appropriate responses to trauma, counseling, and other culturally appropriate and gender-responsive interventions that help students regulate their own physiology. I will add that increasing schools' capacity to develop and apply trauma-responsive strategies that mitigate racial and gender disparities is a central theme of the Ending Pushout Act, which is pending federal legislation introduced by Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley. We know that students learn when they feel safe enough to do so, and that schools become locations for healing and learning when they're not structured as primers for carceral facilities. Each of these interventions should be developed toward the goal of ensuring that schools reopen, that as schools reopen, we not only reduce the number of students overall who experience exclusionary discipline, but that we address the racial and gender disparities along the way. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Morris. That was very enlightening. And I just have to take a minute to say, unfortunately, our second and third panelists, Russ Skiba and Olatunde Johnson, their video feeds have been lost, but we still have them on audio. So our second panelist is going to tell us, Dr. Skiba is going to tell us about his research on disability disparities in school discipline and the virus of racism. We'll just have to listen to Dr. Skiba without being able to see him on the screen. Are you with us?
Yes, yes.
Thank you. Take it away.
Thanks. I'm Russ Skiba, Professor Emeritus at Indiana University. For 25 years, I conducted research disparities in discipline for Black and Brown students, and directed the Equity Project at Indiana University there. I want to start out by saying race is and is not real. We know by now that race it's just simply a social construct, first constructed in the 17th century as a justification for the brutal and inhuman treatment, of those who were enslaved. Yet race is also real. Discrimination due to skin color continues to harm countless lives in medical treatment, housing, juvenile and adult justice, school achievement, environmental justice, special education, placement, corporal punishment, suspension and expulsion, and the effects of school police. We know that race and racism are real and have these negative effects because of data. Yet respect for and the use of data has not been all that it could be in recent years. Unfortunately, the final report of the Federal Commission on School Safety, released in 2018, calling for the rescinding of earlier guidance from the Obama administration, was a prime example of that. Of 42 citations in the section on school discipline, only 4 were drawn from research. Many citations were simply quotes. One cited that the data that was being cited to was referred to by, quote, various speakers at the School Safety Commission hearings. Even when that report does cite to the literature, the document engaged in misleading statements or inaccurate interpretations. The report claimed that, quote, the threat of investigations by the Office for Civil Rights under sub-regulatory documents such as We Think School Discipline Guidance has likely had strong negative impact on school discipline and safety. And they quoted that as being from the National Superintendents Association 2000 School Discipline Survey. Makes it sound like the AASA was very much opposed to school discipline reform. In fact, since 2014, the AASA have been among the strongest national supporters of school discipline reform, stating on their website, harsh and punitive policies, including zero tolerance and the overuse of suspension and expulsion, can devastate the lives of children. We are committed to educational equity and reform to ensure the highest quality education for all students. And I'd encourage you to look at their very progressive webpage on school discipline and removing disparities. The actual findings from that survey were that investigations by the OCR had a strong effect. In fact, they had a stronger effect than other methods to ensure that discipline is equitable, which in its report, the Superintendents Association approved of. The most egregious example in that report is the statement that, quote, when school leaders focus on aggregate school discipline numbers rather than the specific circumstances and conduct that underlie each matter, schools become less safe. One wonders if that report would also have supported ending aggregate numbers for graduation rate, school achievement. We only know that race continues to be real and understand the cause, the harm that racism causes only by collecting and analyzing data. In contrast, the 2014 guiding principles of the Rethink School Discipline package released during the Obama administration included 50 footnotes. Almost 50% of those were based on actual research. We need for that document to be re-released and updated, and I understand that we'll soon see action on that. It's time for a return to data. I want to really briefly touch on some of the more recent data that we know of from the school discipline research. You know, there's a lot of discussion about either ors. You know, is disproportionately something that happens between schools or within schools? Is racism individual or is it systemic? Is it because of implicit bias, or is it due to larger structural forces? Well, the research seems to say it's both. Anderson and Ritter in the 2017 article looked at disproportionality both between schools and within schools and found that both made contributions. Olin and McGlanahan in 2020 article looked at 3 factors: differential treatment in the classroom, student behavior, and between school resources and structures. And they found out that all 3 of those things made a contribution. The strongest one was differential treatment. The second was between school issues. And the third that made very little difference in disproportionality was actually student behavior. There's also growing research that about systemic racism. 2 separate studies have found that rates of disproportionality in discipline are higher in counties with greater levels of implicit bias as measured by the implicit association test. Warren Kupchik found that corporal punishment rates in the South are highest in counties that had the highest historic lynching rates. So bias and discrimination and white supremacy are part of a system of racism that is not either individual or social and systemic, but something that pervades our society and by which we are all influenced. Some of what we've learned during the pandemic about epidemiology suggests that indeed there is a virus of racism. That when folks talk about the pandemics, twin pandemics of the coronavirus and racism, there are in fact a number of pieces to that are similar. We talk about, for the coronavirus, the issue of asymptomatic carriers. We don't know that we are not carriers. We can't see that. So we need to confront racism personally and in our institutions wherever we see it, and we need to fully respect the data. Racism has a 400-year-old head start on us. It will not yield easily. I wish you all the best in your work. Thank you.
Russ, thank you for reminding us how important research is in this time. And now I want to introduce our third panelist, Olatunde Johnson, who is going to speak about, as I mentioned, the importance of Title VI and other civil rights laws and how they can be used to proactively by school districts. Olatunde?
Yeah, great. Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me. So thank you for inviting me to speak and for having this convening. As you said, I'm Olatunde Johnson. I'm a professor of law at Columbia Law School. And I was asked to talk about the role of federal civil rights law in addressing discipline and over-policing of schools. And I wanted to have us, the introduction of this session and of the day, there was a discussion of the grounding in Brown versus Board of Education. And I think this is really important. At the center of any civil rights approach that we talk about Title VI of the 64 Civil Rights Act. And all of you know, I believe, that Title VI prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, ethnicity in federally funded programs. And it's the model of other statutes. You've got Title IX, which deals with gender discrimination, 504 for children with disabilities. But what does it really mean to keep a focus on Brown in Title VI? For me, when I think about the Brown principle, I really think about the idea that federal funds should not be used to further segregation and inequality. That in federal spending, it should be deployed to advance integration and full inclusion. Title VI, from its start, recognized both impact and intent very early on in its history. So we honor Brown each year, and in doing so, I think we have to pay attention to meaning of Brown at the core, which is that full citizenship is not about racial hierarchy, that the state is not neutral, but can and should play an affirmative role in dismantling stigma and segregation. And Brown, of course, is about the really crucial connections between education and democracy. So I don't offer any of this as just a rhetorical point. When we talk about school discipline and policing, I don't think we can separate it from a larger context that looks at segregation of Black and brown children from resources, opportunity, and effective education. And we really have a choice, as a lot of the speakers have been saying, about whether or not we should see schools as a place of social control or as an extension of the carceral state, or whether they are in fact places where we prepare people for higher education, meaningful employment, and full citizenship in the way that Brown requires. So what does this mean functionally? So I think first, it means that to work on school discipline, you have to connect it to addressing segregation. The speakers have really talked about the connection between the conditions facing school, the larger school context, as well as, of course, our racial history and school discipline. And so when you're thinking about designing remedies for school discipline and over policing, it needs to be in the context of addressing questions of segregation and other inequities in schools that serve Black and brown children. And so, an example is one of the groups that advocates in New York, where I live, Integrate New York City, which works with a coalition of groups and is also really affiliated with the National Coalition on School Diversity. When it talks about meaningful integration, it does it through this 5 R's framework. And one of the R's has been restorative justice, where students have really taken the lead in addressing discipline disparities and moving towards police-free schools. But crucially, they're connecting this idea of restorative justice to the other R's. To looking at the racial composition of the schools, the resources, the teachers and professionals who work in schools. So when we talk about Title VI, and I'll mention a bit about Title VI best practices, people have alluded to it. I think these things are very promising, but I'm not confident, given the data and the information we have, that we can really make progress on school discipline without addressing those broader structural conditions. And those are also part of Title VI mandates. So in practical terms, it means using federal resources to deal with segregation, advance meaningful integration. It means addressing the use of funding for policing. It means providing other supports and provisions for students. So a second point I want to emphasize that has come up a lot in the comments today is about data. Title VI and Title IX and 504 really provide an important framework for gathering data on racial, gendered, disability, the disparities and conditions, such as the presence of policing. And this data, as folks have talked about, should be disaggregated. It should also cover intersectional categories. It should be quantitative as well as qualitative. And data really allows us to see the connections between disability, race, ethnicity, poverty, school conditions, and segregation. A lot of what people presented to you today was because we have data. But from an enforcement perspective, I think it's really important to know why we're collecting it. Data can serve as an early warning system. It's also a continual feedback to understand whether or not districts are generating disparities and how interventions that are in place, if they're working. A persistent concern in this area is that we gather a lot of data and it doesn't produce any action. So the point is really to have a mechanism for analyzing that data, both at the federal level and at the state and local level, and that may itself require federal assistance. Of course, investigations need to proceed when there is evidence of systemic discrimination and large-scale disparities, but it should always be published in a regular way so that advocates and others can monitor progress. And then a final thing I want to say about Title VI, Title IX, 504, and this entire approach that in some of my work I've called equality directives. This is the idea that federal spending can be used to leverage change, and that it requires and allows front-end action. And by that I mean it's not just about resolving complaints after the fact, This is maybe how we understand some aspect of the civil rights framework, but really the beauty of these statutes, and I think where they're going to be most powerful, is that they should be used as a way to reduce disparities, to rethink how discipline, climate, restorative, and transformational practices are designed. And there are a range of powerful models for doing so. I mean, Title IX, sexual assault in the context of universities, where universities endeavor to set up robust systems for diminishing sexual assault, providing workshops and resources to students and their advisors, dealing with things like how are dorm rooms set up and shared spaces in schools. I've written about the proactive front-end use of similar mandates in fair housing and in transportation equity. And of course, several speakers have alluded to the Obama administration school discipline guidance, which was withdrawn in the last administration. It also provides a model for front-end use. Of course, it should be updated now to address connections between race and other categories such as disability and gender and LGBTQ status. But it provides a model for thinking about how do you leverage federal funds to create change that's more systematic. So there's much more to say on all of this. Time is short. There's no dearth of resources in the research and advocacy community about how to design meaningful remedies. I'm always happy to be invited to these because I learn a lot, but I just want to emphasize there's a lot of knowledge out there, and it's a matter of creating a robust implementation structure that incorporates both enforcement and learning.
Olatunde, thank you so much for your perspective, and thank you to all of our three researchers, Dr. Morris, Raskiba, and yourself, for stressing the importance of data, stressing that we really do need research and to present that research and understand how that research does help us examine the ongoing systemic racism that we do have to examine in order to once and for all, or get to the root causes of these discipline disparities. So with that, we are going to take a moment to turn over to panel 3. I'm sorry we didn't have time for questions for our researcher panel. And we also have, some people have been asking where they can, if they're going to be able to see this in the future. So we are recording this, and in the future, when it's available, we will send an email to those who have registered, but we will also, you can look for it on ED's YouTube website, so the Department of Education's YouTube website. So with that, we're going to take a short break. So stretch your legs, but don't go away, because panel 3 will be up in just a few seconds or a minute or two. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shahina Simons. I'm here representing the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice, and I have the honor of moderating our final panel of the day. Our first 2 panels brought into sharp focus the harms caused by policies and practices that push kids out of the classrooms, and how those harms are suffered disproportionately by students of color, students with disabilities, and LGBTQ students, and are felt most acutely by students whose identities touch more than one of these groups. For the conclusion of our event today, we are going to hear from 5 panelists about lessons from the field in seeking solutions, ways to avoid those harmful impacts, and to make our schools positive and nurturing places for all of our learners. I can't think of a better group of people to have this discussion with than these 5 panelists. We are a little bit behind time, so I'm going to be very brief in introducing each member of the panel, and then we will jump right in. But I urge you to read more about them and about their work and leadership in the bios that were sent out with the materials. Our first panelist is Isaías Vázquez, Associate Director of Padres y Jóvenes Unidos, which is a parent and youth-led organization working toward educational justice and equity in the Denver public schools. Isa also brings the perspective of having been a student and also a former educator in DPS. Our next panelist is Daniel Kim, who is the iRise Visiting Scholar at the University of Denver. iRise is the Interdisciplinary Research Institute for the Study of Inequality. Daniel served as the Director of Youth Organizing for Padres y Jóvenes Unidos, leading the campaign to end the school-to-jail track, and also served as the Chief of Staff for the Division of Student Equity and Opportunity in DPS. Daniel is also the parent of 2 kids in the Denver Public Schools. Next is Olivia Carter, a school counselor at Jefferson Elementary School in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. Olivia was named the 2021 School Counselor of the Year by the American School Counselor Association. This honor recognized, among other accomplishments, Olivia's work to bring trauma-informed responses and approaches to her school. Our next panelist is Dr. Sierra Kaler-Jones, who is the Director of Storytelling at the Communities for Just Schools Fund. Sierra is a qualitative researcher whose work at CJSF has focused on centering youth, family, and organizers' experiences and stories in education justice work. Sierra is also the primary author of CJSF's recent report on reclaiming social and emotional learning. And our final panelist is Jordan Pasmantir, Director of Policy and Advocacy at Committee for Children, which provides research-based educational programs designed to advance social emotional learning and prevent bullying and sexual abuse of children. Jordan has worked and written extensively on advancing racial equity through approaches like social emotional learning and trauma-informed approaches. So as you can see, we have a wonderful panel with a huge range and depth of experiences. And we want to make sure that our panelists are able to engage with and respond to each other in this conversation in the limited time that we have. So we've structured the panel so that we are going to start with a couple of questions directed at Isaias and Daniel to talk about their work in the Denver Public Schools. And then we will turn to Sierra, Jordan, and Olivia to focus on some questions about social emotional learning and trauma-informed approaches. And then hopefully we will have an opportunity for all 5 of you to respond to common questions and hopefully be able to engage with each other. And if the technology allows, we will also have a few questions from the audience. So with that, we are going to go ahead and start with our Denver panelists. And we know that the work of Padres y Jóvenes Unidos on discipline reform has helped create programs and policies that really are national models. So I want to start by asking our Denver panelists what the biggest lessons are that you've learned in your work in Denver that you would pass on to other advocates or other school districts that are interested in addressing overuse of exclusionary discipline and disparities in their schools. And why don't we start with Isaias and then we can go to Daniel.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you for having me. I am Isaias or Isa Vasquez. I use he, his, him pronouns. I'm also the Associate Director of Padres y Jóvenes Unidos here in Denver, Colorado. I have also been an alumni of Denver Public Schools and an educator for some time. And, you know, Padres y Jóvenes Unidos has been around for 29 years now, since 1992. So we do have, you know, several lessons at PAU that we have learned over the years. We are a community organizing organization, which means that one of the challenges that we have on leading legislative reform as a grassroots organization is on being able to reconcile popular decision-making with the speed of the legislative and policy-making process, right? It can be very challenging to make quick decisions that are necessary when you're accountable to a large membership base, such as our base here at Padres y Jóvenes Unidos, that also expects and deserves to be included in key decision-making when it comes to creating policies. Also, you know, this causes attention, right? So we have to ensure that the youth voice and the leadership are driving forces in this decision-making. This requires accessibility within time, space, language access, as well as extensive preparation work and clear lines of communication. I would say, throughout the years since PAU started doing this work in 1992, one of the biggest lessons has also been to never downplay the role of race in creating or implementing discipline policies within our schools. Race needs to be elevated as the core of the issue. And to this day, when addressing racist discipline practices, we still get told that speaking on race could be divisive, which, frankly, it is a myth, right? We continue to be told this. As a student at DPS, I deserved to know why my school didn't have the resources out in the East Side that other schools, affluent white schools, did in Denver. As an educator, I needed to address race, especially as an educator of color working within a school campus, right? And as an organizer, I also need to uplift race. So, there's really no meaningful long-term process in the issues that matter most to our communities when the role of race is not accounted for. So race is vital, both for historical context, for current analysis of the ongoing forms of systemic racism, and for Black, Indigenous people of color and students with disabilities. We are targeted for ticket suspensions, arrests in schools without really any evidence of higher rates of misbehavior compared to white counterparts. I would say, as a community organizing, we do believe that community organizing is a driving force for systemic change. And so there needs to be space for community organizing. In the words of Frederick Douglass, power concedes nothing without a demand. We can work to pass policy, but the policies themselves, as strong as they may be, have not themselves always translated to the very one improved outcomes for students. And so the beautiful thing about community organizing is that you can bring people together with similar life experiences. You can bring students, their families together on a shared analysis. Youth and their families are directly impacted by the school culture. So this means that they are experts in their own experience and need to be seen as experts and need to be included in the solution process. In community organizing, we create spaces for people to share the shame, the blame, or the internalized racism and understand our experience, allowing those most impacted to find a political space in which they have a voice. And they themselves, the youth, the parents, can be relentless. They can be active participants in the policy and process negotiations impacting them, right? So victories can always be changed and rolled back. And this is why we need mass mobilizations of people that are well-versed in policy, that are ready to take action, and for us to be able to keep our victories. So this is also an accountability mechanism because our policies can always be rolled back. There's also a need for continued vigilance and accountability that prevents the backsliding of policy and culture addressing racism in our schools. So ultimately, our work is around dismantling systemic barriers to political participation and building a more participatory democracy that is responsive to on-the-ground needs and grassroots communities that are full participants in the policy decision-making.
Thank you so much for that, Isaias. I would pose the same question to Daniel in terms of the biggest lessons that you've learned that you'd impart to other districts or other advocates that are looking to make the kind of change that you did in Denver.
Thanks, Sheena. I'm gonna change hats a little bit, I guess, because Isaias, I can plus one on everything that Isaias said, but something that's a perspective that I can bring from sort of the school district and administration side. Isaias mentioned sort of the campaigns that Padres has led for 20 years with both the state, but also with Denver Public Schools. And I was actually invited to serve in a leadership role with student services in the district by the same leaders in the district who we used to take the megaphones and the picket signs and protest that and do the accountability meetings with. And it was a pretty eye-opening experience. And there were some things that I think we couldn't see from the community organizing side in terms of what Isaias was talking about, in terms of what does it actually take to make real change happen all the way to the ground in the school buildings and in the classrooms. And I think, the first thing is really political will is everything. Sometimes we think that it's research or data and litigation, and those things are so important. And the movements we partner with folks doing that work, and they're essential. But at the end of the day, sort of what really drives past the backlash that's emerging now, or the ways that we've heard about suspensions and expulsions and exclusion being pushed off the books. There's so many ways that now, 10, 15, 20 years in, systems are adapting that don't want to change by sort of figuring out how to cover their tracks. So that's one piece. I think the other big, so we need constantly sort of the very uncomfortable mirror that the grassroots organizing groups and racial justice groups hold up to the districts and the systems around what they don't want to look at. The other sort of big lesson that kind of opened my eyes was, when we work with Padres organizes the students who are being expelled and suspended and have the police call on the school all the time. All of the communities that all of the other experts and panelists talked about is who we're organizing. The 10 to 20% of students who are sort of at the quote unquote, most unwanted at the school, who are the most targeted by push out and being criminalized at school. And their experience is pretty whole, like in terms of how they feel treated by the schools. But when I went to work inside the district, it became really clear to me that all of the things that touch on what is experienced as push out and being kind of criminalized at school, they belong to all these different siloed departments. So if you want to take on police, you got to work with the safety department. And if you want to deal with this thing, it's actually special education. And if you want to deal with involuntary mental health holds, it's actually mental health and counseling. And if you want to deal with searches and restraints, that's another place. And if you want to deal with coercive transfers, like being kicked out of school, which is what students and families experiences, I got kicked out of school. That could be like actually 3 different departments that are working. Like it's enrollment, it's like, there's a whole bunch of things. So I think Diane mentioned this at the beginning, but there's a real need for a coalition inside the school districts and the schools to sort of say, let's de-silo all these things. We all own different pieces of what on the tip of the iceberg looks like suspensions and expulsions, but actually includes all these other things that other panelists have brought up, like the searches, the restraints, even threat assessments. Like, what are all the things that students and families experience in schools that make them feel like they're not wanted there, they're not valued, that they're disposable, right? And I guess the last thing would be is, school discipline is not, often in education work, we think of it as like a specialized topic, but it's actually the foundation for anything good you can do in a school to transform it. Like, there's so much instructional bias in how teachers are trained and how principals are trained. It's like everything is about that. But in our district, what really moved the needle in terms of having a superintendent who was able to listen to the community was instead of discipline being the reduction of disparities being a thing that was just the job of student services, they actually put it into the prioritized goals for the superintendents and instructional chain of command down through the principals. So in a lot of districts, if you have discipline and it's siloed off as like a student services kind of support issue versus like a core academic thing, you can't, it's really hard. It becomes fragmented because it's not a part of that focus. And I would say the other piece of de-siloing would be, to have Department of Ed and DOJ here working together on this issue. I mean, the school to prison pipeline is the nexus of education and sort of prisons and mass incarceration. And there's so much great work happening on the ground actually with over on the in the grassroots world where the movement organizes formerly incarcerated and system involved youth and families, where you can look at reports that show how people's pathways into incarceration all begin with DMC, which right? It begins actually in schools. So those are some big lessons I think that we're drawing out of the work.
Thank you so much. There was a lot to unpack there, and any panelists, if you would like to respond at any point and jump into this rich conversation, please just raise your hand in the chat. But I'd like, before we moved on to our next group, I'd like to unpack a couple of things that Isaias and Daniel said. At the very beginning, Isaias raised the point about how much of this is about race, and yet when the effort to raise the subject within the school is made, that the response is often, this is divisive. And so my question is really a pragmatic one. How do you overcome that resistance and that pushback? And you can, you can feel free to answer that from the advocate side or the educator administrator side, either one of you.
Yeah, so when we are told that we are being divisive, we always agree that we have similar goals as many education institutions, right? We know that at the end of the day, we have similar goals of graduating our students, having them be fully prepared for post-secondary education, and also keeping them out of this country's jail and prison systems. We know, and we heard from previous panelists, of the harm that race-neutral policies can create. And so we often find ourselves in places where white students are the ones who just benefit from race-neutral discipline policies and affecting Black, Indigenous, people of color students, right? And so many times we do have to work from a place of we actually share similar goals of getting our students out of high school, graduating with their diploma. And so that is one of the first steps that we do work with people in power, where we actually see them, that make them see that we actually have similar goals when it comes to race. Also, we just highlight the harm, right? Unapologetically, we highlight that data that we talked about earlier, in other panelists talked about earlier. The data speaks also the story of the racism that we experience. And so that's not, it's not up for discussion, it's undeniable, and we need solutions to address racism within our schools.
Maybe just to echo around the data piece, because it's such a big part of, Department of Ed and DOJ's potential role here is, when we get asked that, it's often because we're talking about data. Like we're talking about Colorado or Denver data that shows what other panelists say, which is we're saying Black students are 6 times more likely to be suspended or expelled, right? And all of that, going from there to all of the disparities that show up. And then they say we're being divisive. We say this is not our data. This is the school's data, right? I mean, this is, like Isaiah was saying, these are the facts, right? It's also not a surprise that basically, when the other side pushes back, they often push to sort of, like Russ was talking about, to sort of diminish the role of data or research, right? Or to even begin to pull back like what can be collected in data. I think, the CRDC data collection has been so important, but in Denver, it hasn't been as useful because it's delayed. I think is about 3 to 5 years that we have to wait for that data to actually become usable. And by the time we're fighting struggles on the ground, we have schools telling us, well, that data is 3 to 5 years old. Like we have a new principal now. We have we've had to also push to expand the data. So like we were talking about before, when we want to talk about race, we want to talk about it connected to, special education, connected to gender and sexuality, connected to all these other important categories. But one of the big things that Padres has won recently was in 2012, we won part of the state code change that required collection of law enforcement and system resolution in schools. So basically in most states, what happens in schools with law enforcement criminalization is a black box. You have, law enforcement referrals is what's collected. That's a notoriously inaccurate, schools don't even know what that is a lot of times. Is it when the SRO does something on their own? Is it when the school calls the SRO? A lot of schools will say, well, we don't count a number there until the school actually calls the SRO, and if the SRO goes in on their own, we don't count that as a law enforcement referral. We pushed for a law that basically requires every one of the 180 law enforcement agencies in the state to report specifically activity that they do on school campuses, which if you try to do that through data requests is an insanely difficult thing across the state. So there's a state requirement. It took 3 years to actually win the money for them to implement it, but we now get data from every DA and every law enforcement agency around specifically what they've done in schools. And it's eye-opening. It's not surprising to us who are advocates and on the ground, but that's what it takes to now begin to dismantle, win this resolution that we won here in Denver to remove the police from schools. But I think other panelists have mentioned all these other areas where we don't have the data, and a big struggle here to address that issue of race has been, well, we're doing fine now, right? The suspensions are gone. Well, they've all been pushed to ISS, to in-school suspension, which in-school suspension can be either an amazing alternative situation, like cultural climate situation, or it can be sitting in a silent room looking at a wall. It can be worse than an out-of-school suspension. It can lead to somebody not wanting to be there.
Thank you so much. We will come back to some of these themes and points that you've raised. But I want to go to Olivia and Jordan and Dr. Kaler-Jones to talk about some of their work. And so that we have sort of a common baseline for the rest of the conversation, I am going to ask our panelists to define a couple of terms for the group. And so I think we'll start with Jordan. Jordan, if you could give us a brief definition of social emotional learning, that would be great.
Sure, happy to. So let's talk about SEL. I know a lot of you have heard about it, and we have varying ideas of what it means across the country, but generally, broadly, it's the process of acquiring and applying knowledge, attitudes, skills to manage emotions, set and achieve positive goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain positive relationships, and make responsible and caring decisions. Think of it this way. It's self-regulation and management. It's relationship skills. It's responsible decision-making. That's what over half the states at this point are organizing their idea around what SEL means. But of particular relevance here today, the definition of social emotional learning is deepening to more intensely embrace student voice and agency, student identity and belonging. But if I may, let me toss the ball to Dr. Sierra Kaler-Jones, whom I think offers some really good insights on what all else social emotional learning could entail.
Thanks, Jordan. I appreciate you. And at CJSF, we are a donor collaborative. We resource community organizers that are fighting for racial justice in schools. And so alongside our national network of partners, which is inclusive of youth organizers, educator organizers, parent organizers, and intergenerational organizing groups. So it's so great to see our comrades on here, Padres. We rewrote the SEL definition to center community demands. And so our collective community-based SEL definition is that culturally affirming SEL is the process through which people of all ages recognize and process emotions, set and strive towards personal and collective goals and liberation while embracing failures as lessons, to feel and show empathy, establish and maintain positive relationships with ourselves, our land, our community, make collective decisions, identify the intersections between the isms, including colonialism, white supremacy, anti-Blackness, homophobia, cispremacy, linguicism, ableism, and all forms of oppression. And then lastly, to dream the world that we all deserve into being, a world rooted in equity, justice, joy, and love.
Thank you for that, Jordan and Dr. Kaler-Jones. I will turn it over to Olivia, perhaps, if you could give us a definition of trauma-informed practices or approaches.
Yeah, so trauma-informed practices are what we like to call a lens, and it starts with acknowledging the prevalence and the widespread impact of trauma in our students, staff, and families' lives. And these practices are intentionally designed so that we avoid re-traumatization at school. While there is no checklist, we start by recognizing and being aware of our own experiences of trauma, our mental health needs, and our needs for healing so that we can co-regulate with our students. We unpack our biases, privilege, and kind of tear down systems of oppression that we might be upholding. We understand how trauma and stress show up in our classroom and utilizing restorative practices to ensure that everyone feels safe, seen, valued, and celebrated.
Thanks, Olivia. I want to thank all three of you for giving us those definitions to get us started in a common place. I want to pose a question to all three of you that I think ties together a lot of what we've heard throughout the day. And the question is, what should schools keep in mind when dealing with a diverse student body to make sure that when they implement social emotional learning and trauma-informed practices, that they are doing that in a way that meets the needs of and speaks to the experiences of all students. And Olivia, if you would kick us off, please.
Yes, thank you. As an educator who carries a lot of privilege myself, it's imperative that I decenter myself in the classroom because students are the experts in their own lives and their experiences. So at my school specifically, we have community circles every single day, and we incorporate current events. You know, we're in elementary school, but we talk about current events so that students can truly voice their opinions and share their knowledge. As a community of educators, when we are planning activities, we start to look at it from the perspective of who does this center, who is missing, and is there a better resource for this? Is there a better way we can do this? And we really start that critical self-reflection with what do you notice and what do you wonder? So reflection has been huge and a critical practice. That's not just being trauma-informed, but dismantling systems that have historically oppressed groups of students. And just as a side note, we know we truly can't be trauma-informed if we're not equity-centered. So I'll let someone else, Jordan, jump in.
Sure, thank you. So let me build a little bit on what we're hearing. It's inevitably problematic to take away a teacher's toolkit without giving them something even better. And we know exclusionary discipline, kicking a kid out of school or a classroom, as a tool is used disproportionately against kids of color. It's not helping them learn or develop or engage with school. So what are some better tools for that? Because if we don't have them, disparities are going to take on different forms, like arrests or seclusion restraint, like we heard earlier, or other kinds of in-school punishments, in-school segregation, and so on. Social emotional learning and trauma-informed practices, especially through an equitable lens, provide evidence-based strategies that can replace harmful, ineffective, exclusionary discipline. They can flip punishment to relationship. They can flip demoralizing consequences to more humanizing interactions. And this is not just true for students, but teachers as well. When teachers have social emotional learning and trauma-informed practices for themselves in their toolkit, they become more agile, more responsive to what's going on with the individual kid, more tuned into that kid's particular context and background. And I believe these tools help teachers get to one of the most powerful, most fundamental reasons they probably joined the workforce in the first place, and that's for the love of teaching and learning and growing up the next generation of kids into healthy adults. Dr. Kaler-Jones?
Thank you. And to add, as we're talking about social emotional learning, one of the things that we've learned from our partners, well, we've learned many things, and I have many recommendations, but I'll stick to two for today. And that one is that we also must think about moving away from SEL as another form of policing. And two, we have to create environments where SEL can actually happen. So as we think about SEL moving away from policing, following the lead of our partners, when we say police-free schools, we do not only mean getting rid of police, the noun, but policing as a verb. And SEL has the potential, it really does, to be a tool for liberation. But we've seen how a lot of well-intentioned frameworks use it as another tool to police Black and Brown young people and LGBTQ+ young people in particular. Many of the conversations and practices and curricula are too often based on white, cisgender, heteropatriarchal, ableist norms and values, which further enact emotional and psychological violence. Even the language around manage and control themselves and their emotions makes us think and wonder about conforming and constricting identities and not being able to express our fullest and most authentic selves. And then in creating a container or an environment for SEL to happen, nationally, we see there's no container for SEL to happen. If there are police in schools, there's biometric data tracking, as we heard from some of the other panelists, bills that are curbing the rights of transgender young people, pushes for patriotic education, schools as fortresses, and then, as Jordan said, educators and administrators not being supported in their own SEL development. And so we have to think about how can you be self-aware if the curriculum erases your ancestral knowledge and epistemologies? Who is defining what responsible decision-making is inclusive of and not? How can we be socially aware if there's state legislation and district policy that bans truth-telling about history and the critique of oppression? How can we identify and understand our emotions if emotions like righteous rage are policed? And so we really have to think about uplifting SEL as a tool for transforming schools instead of using it to conform, making young people conform to structures that deny their humanity.
Thank you. I want to make sure that I give you opportunities to respond to each other. So if anyone, again, if anyone wants to jump in, please raise your hand or just unmute yourself. But to follow up on that last question a little bit and some of the issues that you raised, I want to ask just a pragmatic question about what schools can do to use SEL, to use trauma-informed practices, specifically to address discipline disparities, whether based on race, based on disability, based on intersection of and overlapping discrimination. And Olivia, maybe we can start with you if you want to respond to that from the school perspective.
Yeah. So from a school counseling perspective, of course, I'm going to say we need more school counselors in our schools. And so a really important piece of this is that a truly trauma-informed school isn't going to involve school resource officers in disciplinary actions with students. And we know that the school to prison pipeline doesn't start in junior high or high school. It starts in pre-K. So instead of using school counselors instead of using school resource officers, using school counselors or social workers who are trained in mental health to help students who may be seen as dysregulated.
Thanks, Olivia. Dr. Kaler-Jones, did you want to add to that?
Sure. I'd like to highlight some examples from our partners of organizing work that they've been doing in some of it very much in partnership with schools. So I'd like to highlight Black Organizing Project in Oakland, California. They won a decade-long fight for police-free schools with the passage of the George Floyd resolution to eliminate the Oakland Schools Police Department. And so this resolution eliminated the school district's internal police department and instead invest the budget in student support services, like Olivia highlighted for us, the importance of counselors, as well as annual implicit bias and anti-racism training for all school staff. As another example, Californians for Justice in California, they have a relationship-centered schools model, and that's rooted in one, valuing student voice. So that looks like collaboration between students, administrators, and teachers through youth-driven design teams to develop new practices together. Secondly, investing in staff, so really in providing staff professional development on SEL and unconscious bias on anti-racist teaching. And then thirdly, creating space for relationship building. So they have advisory structures where students stay with a caring adult all year, all of the 4 years of their high school experience. And Californians for Justice has learned that students can lead professional development for teachers and the importance of implementing SEL in an effective way. And then lastly, just to highlight one more example, in Chicago, Kofi Power Pack Illinois and Voices of Youth, Chicago Education, also known as VOICE, they organized to replace Chicago Public Schools' zero tolerance policy with a student code of conduct rooted in restorative justice. They successfully championed the elimination of suspension for children under 3rd grade, elimination of expulsion for students under 6th grade, and then also banning of group punishments, so things like silent lunch. Voice also successfully advocated for the state to create a Rethinking Safety grants program, so thinking about the funding aspect of this work that expands resources for mental and behavioral health, restorative justice, and other trauma-informed supports for youth. So really thinking about the power of moving funds and divesting from harmful and school hardening efforts and really investing them in opportunities for social emotional learning.
Jordan, do you want to jump in as well?
Yeah, there's something especially Dr. Kaler-Jones said a little earlier, which makes me think one of the things we really got to do is switch mindsets. It's really problematic to conceive of the issues we're talking about in this panel as being disciplinary in nature. It sometimes ends up with folks talking about fixing kids or trying to make them comply, maybe just finding new ways to punish them, like sending kids to the SEL room for correction. That's not what social emotional learning or trauma-informed practices are really about. Fundamentally, SEL and trauma-informed practices for the purposes of effective and equitable teaching and learning, helping kids grow up to be awesome adults. So the admonishment she provided earlier that we can weaponize this to perpetuate or exacerbate inequity needs to be taken seriously. It's paramount that we draw these practices from research, that we overlay them with the research body around what we know about how to make more just, equitable, and humanizing learning environments. Something everybody who's with us today can think about and ask to their learning communities is whether the social emotional learning work in schools is developmentally sound. Does it promote and produce safe and welcoming learning environments? Does it help kids enable positive relationships, help them resolve conflicts peaceably? Does it prevent bullying? Is it racially and culturally affirming and not another form of surveillance? It needs to be in line with identity-safe classrooms, embracing cultural diversity, cultivating regular use of diverse materials, ideas, activities. It needs to create relationships in caring, orderly, and purposeful classroom environments. And if it's missing any of that, it's worth having a deeper conversation with your school, your central office, what have you.
Thanks so much, everyone. I want to bring Daniel and Isaias back into the conversation so that we can talk about some things that have come up in both sets of questions. I would ask, just so we've talked a lot about the work of Padres Unidos, but we haven't talked specifically that much about restorative practices. So I wanted to ask about some tools or resources that you can share with attendees who want to learn more about using restorative practices specifically, as well as SEL or trauma-informed practices to reduce discipline disparities. And I guess I would just start, if either of the Denver panelists, Isaias or Daniel, want to share anything from your experience in Denver, if you want to start, and then we can see if the rest of the panel has any thoughts.
Is it okay if I start on this one, Lisa? Just hearing Sarah and Jordan and Olivia talking just made me think about one thing as we kick this part off is one of the risks or the concerns that we've had about the rise of trauma-informed and RJ and SEL is exactly what Sarah was talking about, which is that if those are not implemented with a race-conscious and race-centering lens, you get all kinds of distortions and co-optation and, as Jordan said, weaponization. Like for instance, if you don't have a race-conscious lens and you train all the teachers in your building in RJ, and you've never talked about bias, then who in the school will get the new great RJ and who will still get the police call on them? You know who that's, and because what this gets to is why we see rates come down for suspensions and expulsions, and yet disparities persist, or even in most cases, we've seen the data across the country get worse. Like actually, even as the overall treatment gets better, the treatment of students of color gets worse, right, compared to white students, and it's because of things like this. Or like trauma-informed can be great, but what if it's sort of a backdoor to repathologize Black students and students of color? Like, oh, it used to be like, oh, those kids, we have to punish them, we have to treat them tough, and now it becomes sort of the pity racism of like, oh, the poor things, right? They're all damaged, right, because of trauma. And then SEL, like at the beginning, in the framing, we heard about how all of this work is really about changing adults. It's not about changing students. I remember Russ Fiba, one time when he came to visit Padres, he told us about the data, and he was saying basically, if you're the parent or the family of a Black or brown student or Indigenous student, and you're worried that they're going to get suspended or targeted by police at school, what's the best thing you could do? It's not actually change their behavior, because it has nothing to do with their behavior. It would be to move schools. because it's not really about the behavior. It's about how adults respond to that behavior. So if we're using social emotional learning as a strategy, what is it implying about who has to do the learning? It's like Jordan was saying, it's the students again and the families that have to learn something, that something's deficient in them, right? Versus if it's a mindset shift, it's really about the adults that need to do the learning, right? So around restorative justice implementation, I would say, we were one of the first districts in the country to implement like what was called a multi-site pilot, where we actually collaborated with the district. Even though we were struggling and fighting the district too, we also collaborate at the same time. And we built we got some funding from the state to hire basically full-time restorative justice coordinators in 6 schools. And some of the big lessons that we've learned out of that in the decades since have been, if the principal isn't on board, so basically all of our lessons are about not so many of the trainings around RJ that schools are working with are how to train people on how to do circles or how to do mediation or how to do, which is important. Like people need to know the practices, but there's, I think sort of the really important edge right now is around what does actual whole school implementation look like? Like, how do you get it from being just that thing that the one person does in that office over there, and you send the bad kids over to that person now, and they get to do something that's not suspension, versus like, how do you get it to be something that actually changes the mindset of the school, and even how the teachers teach and how the counselors work with students in the classrooms. And the big 3 things that came out of that were, the principal has to be on board, and then by extension, if you're doing district-wide implementation, there has to be leadership from the top of the district to say this is a priority. You have to have someone who's sort of a dedicated champion, like an RJ coordinator in the building. And you have to actually do a lot of work with the whole school community, especially the classroom teachers, so that they see it as how they change their relationships to the students versus just a thing that happens. So I guess probably one of the hard lessons that schools could take away from how we've implemented is actually a lot of us are rethinking, like, should we even start with RJ as a alternative to suspension and expulsion? Because once you do that, you set it up as it's still in the punitive model, versus a lot of the best schools that we saw implemented were ones that said, no, this is not how we want to be with our students, right? And they changed it rolled through all the different layers of how the school works. A lot of the districts that we're advising now in other places and schools in Denver, when they say we want to do RJ, it's don't start with diversion of auspices role. Actually, don't even go there. Start with relationship, like RJ as relationship building. Because if the student or an adult has sort of committed a harm, it's like, really, what is there to restore to? If all you do is you teach the mediation and you haven't built the community and the relationships, there isn't the sense of like, I want to repair that. Because the relationship, if I don't care, and if I just want to say, well, F that, like just suspend me because I don't want to go through that, or I don't care about that person, it doesn't mean anything. So that's one of the big things around RJ implementation. If folks want to, we have some reports and actually a 3-year implementation guide that takes people through kind of the hard lessons, but also what are the look-fors in year 1 when you implement, in year 2 when you implement, and then what are some of like the myths and the pitfalls that schools tend to encounter. We partnered with the NEA, with our local teachers union, with Advancement Project, and our school district here to basically create a blueprint and an implementation guide, and it's available. I'll put it in the chat, but there's all kinds of, there's webinars on there, there's like supplemental tools you use with the implementation guide. But it all came out of this work of like pushing the political will and then finding the partnerships with, the teachers union, the district, and our national partners.
Thanks, Daniel. I want to give other panelists a chance to talk about kind of respond to that tools and resources question. But I also want to, in the time that we have after that, to get back to Daniel's point about pitfalls and things to avoid. So just on the tools and resources question, Jordan, did you have anything that you wanted to point our attendees to?
Well, the standard place to look if you're trying to figure out just the ground level of social emotional learning might be to go to the Collaborative on Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, CASEL. They are helping facilitate a lot of district work as well as a lot of state level thinking on this, and very much are shifting to include more voices in participation of creating social emotional learning policy, guidance, implementation. I wonder if Dr. Kaler-Jones might have additionals to add, but I would just say check out CASEL as a starting point to learn more.
Dr. Kaler-Jones, can we turn it over to
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. My brain is full of so many resources that I'd love to share. So thanks for passing it over to me. I think, Shahina, you mentioned in the beginning of the conversation the report that we put together with our national network of partners called Reclaim Social Emotional Learning, Centering Organizing Praxis for Holistically Safe Schools. Also at Communities for Just Schools Fund, we have a hashtag Reclaim SEL webinar series and resources that are available on our website. I'll also highlight a few partner examples. So Communities United uses a Healing Through Justice framework. Partners at Dignity in Schools campaign is doing a lot of really powerful and moving work around restorative justice and also transformative justice. And what does that mean? What does that look like? What does it feel like? And then as Daniel was talking about how oftentimes restorative justice and even trauma-informed responses are being co-opted in many ways, we look to Sean Ginwright, wrote an incredible piece on Medium about healing-centered engagement. So moving from trauma-informed to healing-centered engagement. I'd also like to lift up Village of Wisdom and Discriminology. They have a culturally affirming climate survey for educators and for school districts that was actually created in partnership with young people and communities. And then also for educators looking for curriculum, I know myself, the Zen Education Project has multiple campaigns. So Teach Reconstruction, Teach the Black Freedom Struggle, Rethinking Schools has a publication, Teaching for Black Lives, and then a new book from Haymarket Books on Black Lives Matter at School, which really makes critical connections between school climate and safety, school discipline, culturally affirming social emotional learning, and also moving towards curriculum that is anti-racist and culturally affirming as well.
Thanks. We will speak to our colleagues at Education and figure out if there's a way to get some of these resources out to folks in some sort of follow-up communication. But I wanted to see if either Olivia or Isaias had anything to add to the question about tools or resources that we can point our attendees to.
Well, I would love to point people to so PAU does have a Lessons in Racial Justice and Movement Building publication. So I would love for everyone to check this out. We have been doing this since 1992, and we have been able to pass several policies starting in 2005 with a release of a report on data highlighting the over-reliance on police, which led to several policy changes. One of them being in 2008, the other one being in 2013 with an intergovernmental agreement between Denver Public Schools and the Denver Police Department that limits the role of police in schools, which eventually led to our Counselors Not Cops resolution in DPS, Denver Public Schools, last year in 2020. And so this policy directs the district to ensure that there's no police or constant law enforcement or security or armed security presence of any kind in Denver Public Schools, reallocating funds to hire additional school-based social workers, psychologists, racial justice coordinators. And so I do want to share this tool because it is a movement building tool, and we have all our lessons learned in racial justice, ending the school to prison pipeline. So hopefully we can get that tool out to you all.
Yeah, I see so many excellent resources that are being shared, and I would just share, if you're a teacher who's looking to maybe unpack your bias or your impact, I would look at Lanisha Tabb and Naomi O'Brien's book, Unpack Your Impact, at the elementary level. I would echo what Jordan says. I think CASEL is a great place to start, but also start looking for things that are equity-centered and trauma-informed. There's a new book coming out by Alex Chevron-Bennett, who is her writing and speaking is based on equity-centered trauma-informed education. And I would look for Dr. Dina Simmons and her work in the realm of SEL, if you can find them via Google, Twitter, or Instagram.
Thanks, Olivia. Well, we only have about 2 minutes left, and I don't want to end on the note of further pitfalls and lessons learned. There's been so many ideas, so much richness to this discussion, and I want to thank all of you. But I want to end with one last question. I know we don't have a student on this panel, but I feel like we need to end this with a question about students. Especially given that Padres y Jóvenes Unidos is a student-centered, student-led, and family-led organization. And so the question I want to pose to all of you is how can we all make sure to lift up students and make sure students can be as involved in possible in making their school environments safe and inclusive places, because really that's what this is all about. And Sierra, if you want to take that, and then anyone else who would like to jump in, that would be great.
Sure. So I think first and foremost, I'll say as we do this SEL work, we all have to do it for ourselves. And so starting with ourselves, and as Olivia highlighted, the importance of unpacking the ways that control and management show up in ourselves, because our society is deeply rooted in a policing, control, and management framework and techniques. And so really unpacking those for ourselves so that we can show up fully for young people to authentically and wholeheartedly listen. I know many of our partners uplift young people, youth organizers, and just letting them lead and following their demands and following all that they have to share with us and their expertise and their brilliance, but then also making sure to actually follow up with those things, because it's irresponsible for us to say, let's listen to young people, and then don't actually create the environments for them to do what they are asking of our systems and of our structures. I know many schools have uplifted young people on school boards and other bodies like school boards. And so having them actually have voting power in many ways is so important, because sometimes they have young people in these capacities in a performative way. So how do we move beyond performative ways of lifting up young people's voice, but actually letting them lead and following them and supporting them in the process?
Thank you. Olivia?
That was so well said. I would echo that and just say that everything is relationship based. None of this matters if you don't have a relationship with the students and truly listening and responding to them.
Thank you. Does anyone else want the last word? If not, I will say yes.
Yeah, thank you. Not necessarily that I wanted the last word, but I do want to highlight, in recent years here in Denver, we've seen an increase in migrant students, especially from Central America, and students who are monolingual, Spanish speaking, who are arriving in our schools, right? And so we have a need to look at the school to prison pipeline also from a deportation lens, right? That we need to address policing in our schools from an immigration standpoint, because it has been harmful. Many of our communities, the very last time that we saw our neighbor, our family, was the last time that they had contact with a police officer for a broken tail light in many of our states. And so we need to address the school to prison pipeline from an education standpoint. So we also stop sending our students to prisons early on, but also look at it through an immigration lens that will possibly be affecting many of our students now and in recent upcoming years as the undocumented student population continues to increase, especially, again, like I mentioned, students from Central America that are newly arrived migrants. Yeah.
Thank you, Isaias. thank you to everyone. I wish that we had twice as much time, 3 times as much time to talk more to each of you. But so appreciate your being here to lend these insights to us. And I have the role of closing out our convening today. And so I just want to say how much I personally and we at the Department of Justice and at the Department of Education appreciate the time that everyone has taken to join us here today. And that includes our esteemed panelists and presenters who are really leading the charge to make change real and make the promise of Brown real in our schools, and have shared such valuable information with us. I want to thank our attendees for their interest in and commitment to these issues. And of course, students and youth activists and advocates for their collective and powerful call to action. So I'll just remind everyone that the recording of this program will be available on the Department of Education's YouTube in a week or 2. And I'll just leave us by saying I hope that we can all commit to marking this anniversary of Brown by standing on the shoulders of and honoring the legacy of Barbara Johns, and by doing everything we can every day to make all students feel truly welcome and truly included in every school in this country. We cannot rest until the promise of Brown is a reality for all students. For my part, I can pledge that the Justice Department and the federal government will continue the important work to fight discrimination wherever we find it. But we also need all of you to continue your important work in this area in your schools and communities. And we value your feedback, both today and going forward, as we work together to ensure that all students have safe, inclusive learning environments. Thank you again for all that you do every day and for joining us today.